Hello everyone, welcome to the 2-year subscriber Q&A video, where I answer your questions about Merida, the Fated, and the stories so far. I want to first thank everyone for the questions they submitted, and to thank you all for your support, encouragement, suggestions, and engagement. Thanks for making this channel what it is and for helping to make it bigger than it was ever meant to be. Now, let's get started with the questions. Some of Merida's powers can only be used in the world she was in when she received them. Which ones are they, and how many are there? I'm going to assume you're referring to Merida's statement to Batman when she said this. Nothing too important, I shrugged. A couple of my abilities can't really be used except in very particular circumstances. They're not even worth mentioning if I'm being honest, since they were kind of limited to the universe I gained them in. This was a blatant lie on Merida's part. Batman even doubted the statement. Merida currently retains every power and ability she accumulates throughout the stories, though that won't always be the case. Will Melisandre come back in the Game of Thrones story, or is that too spoilery? She will not be coming back. Her fate is probably among the top 3 things Merida's done that you could point to and say was evil, at least from a modern perspective. From a medieval perspective, Merida was the queen, and Melisandre was a foreign priest attempting to manipulate one of her highest-ranking lords, then decided to throw Merida some shade. It's also an excellent example of how Merida's emotions can get the better of her in certain situations. Will Static Shock show up in the DC story? Static Shock is one of my favorite DC characters. You may take from that what you will. Does Merida ever feel like the villain after killing or doing other terrible stuff, or does she have no fear of turning into what she hates one day? It would depend on the terrible thing she does. In the Dragon Age story, she felt horrible about having to kill Kaelin to ensure Serena's rise. However, she had no remorse or sympathy when she betrayed her brothers in Game of Thrones, because she knew they would cause more harm than good in the long run. When it comes to terrible things, she's very hot or cold, with no real in-between. It's easier for her to send hundreds to their death than it is for her to personally kill a single person for what would be essentially the same goal. While many of her actions can easily be said to be fascistic or despotic, in Merida's mind, they're necessary to make the world better for her people. Will we ever be Merida as a villain in a story and fight the other Fated? Not as a misunderstanding or from a different standpoint, but with her being the actual villain of the story. I have already started this story, and its first chapter was a massive hit. Merida will be leading the Skaven into the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where there are no good guys. She will be a villain, acting in the role as a villain. In fact, you'll see that she continues to use similar tactics from her previous conquests, but with the perspective of her being a villain, so that people can see that there's always a very fine line between her altruism and her willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve her goals. Since Merida was a male in her first life, how did she get used to the changes so easily? And did she ever by habit use male toilets or something similar? Little details like that get skipped over, but do make for humorous anecdotes. She was a newborn infant when she first reincarnated in the form we're used to seeing her. She had years to get used to being a female before puberty, and the like made any major changes to those bodily functions occur. Were there a few, "oh, it doesn't work like that anymore" moments? Sure, but they weren't major, and were genuinely minor inconveniences. And since medieval worlds don't have male or female toilets, this was never a concern. In fact, the first time she encounters bathrooms for different genders is in the cyberpunk universe, when she's had nearly 600 years of time being a woman to naturally go into the woman's bathroom. In the Dragon Age universe, did Merida ever do poses in front of a mirror and go, "I'd definitely smash that"? I had never actually considered this, but I'm sure she would have been curious to see how she developed. So, it's canon now. She definitely did at some point. Have your emotions about the series changed over time since you started it? Absolutely. I started the channel thinking it would be a single story channel. I'd write it, put it up on YouTube, and hope people enjoyed it for what it was. And the more people enjoyed it, and the more they requested to see Merida in different universes, the more I had to consider about her, the fated, and a larger overarching narrative. These stories have allowed me to dive deeper into the personalities of the characters, how much I've come to care for their perspectives, and how much I want to see things through for them. It also makes me happier than I can express that other people are just as invested in Merida's story, and I put in a lot of effort to make that investment pay off. It has been stated that Merida's physical capabilities compound with each reincarnation. Does that include the Dragon Age universe? What characters would she be comparable to in each universe as her stats increase? Yes, this does include the Dragon Age universe, since it was her first reincarnation. As far as which character's physical stats she would be comparable to in each universe, here's a quick list at her physical peak in each universe. Dragon Age, Captain America. Fallout, Crossbones. Game of Thrones, Spider-Man. Cyberpunk, Luke Cage. Skyrim, Colossus. Star Wars, Wonder Woman. That time I got reincarnated as a slime. Superman. DC, Superman Prime. Dragon Ball, Cosmic Armor, Superman. Whatever happened to the 8th Fated, who was a farmer back in Thedas during the Dragon Age story? You're referring to Liam, and he is easily the most unique of the Fated, since he only ever showed up in a single side story chapter. Liam was reincarnated into Thedas as an origin that Merida wasn't even sure would be there since the files for the origin were in the game, but it was never implemented. Liam was happy with living the simple life of a farmer and wanted nothing to do with politics or the wider goings-on in the world. Merida was envious of his option to lead a quaint, quiet life and respected his choice. Because of that, he isn't pulled into any adventures afterwards. That doesn't mean, however, that he hasn't been in any of the other universes. If Merida was moved into Diablo or a similar ARPG like Grim Dawn, what style of combat would she choose? Merida defaults to magic first, so if she arrived in any such universe, she would choose range and spells over close combat. However, as she's shown on multiple occasions, she's still more than willing to fight in close quarters with heavy armor and a warhammer. Do other characters beyond Merida and the Fated reincarnate into other worlds? If you mean do other characters beyond Merida and the other Fated appear in other stories? Yes. In fact, Mehrunes was such a popular character that he has appeared in every mainline story other than Dragon Age. The only characters that have a higher appearance record than him are Merida and Seven. However, if you're referring specifically to reincarnation, then no. In fact, and this might blow your mind a bit, but Merida is the only character to actually reincarnate. Have fun speculating with that little tidbit. Why is it that whenever Merida gets injured or has just the right amount of insults thrown her way, she reacts with overwhelming force, but doesn't use that same force in other situations that would make them easier? Merida has a bit of a temper. She doesn't like inconveniences, minor or otherwise. Normally she writes them off and deals with them. However, whenever already irritated or angry, her fuse is short and simply reacts. Just like anyone who might get angry and slam a fist on their desk, punch a wall, or scream, Merida also vents her frustration. And like anyone else, if she gets injured, she'll lash out to deal with the pain. Typically, when she exercises that overwhelming force you mentioned, it's to end a conflict she was already irritated with, or end it because she was hurt in the process of trying to end it. That isn't always the case, though. Merida is under constant stress and scrutiny throughout most of her life, in every lifetime. You could argue that it's a fault of her own ambition, but when enough of it piles up, she gets a hair trigger. You have noticed that she tends to get emotional in certain situations, and doesn't tend to think rationally. She's a long-term planner, preferring to react in where she can take time to assess the situation and respond accordingly. If she's not given time, she tends to opt for the fastest, most efficient end to a situation. That's it for this year's Q&A video. Thank you to everyone who submitted their questions. Hopefully next year we'll have even more to ask about. Thank you again to everyone who watches the videos, enjoys the stories, and interacts with me in the comments. You all make this an absolute labor of love, and I'm happy to be able to bring you stories that you enjoy. Let's keep pushing to see where Merida goes from here to reach 2,000 subs, and see each other next year for another Q&A video.